Picture this. You are a Roman soldier. You stand guard on the empire's eastern frontier. The sun is just starting to rise, painting the sky in pale colors. Then, you hear it. A low rumble in the distance. Like thunder. But you look up, and the sky is clear and blue. The sound grows louder, more intense. It vibrates up through your boots. And you realize it's not thunder. It's hooves. Thousands of them. Maybe tens of thousands. The ground begins to tremble beneath your feet. You tighten your grip on your spear. Your knuckles turn white. You remember the stories veterans told in the taverns. Stories your commander laughed off as fairy tales, meant to scare new recruits. Stories about warriors who drank the blood of their enemies. About a warlord who melted the gold of conquered cities, and great fires and ate his simple meals watching it flow. And then you see them. They crest the hill like a dark wave. Your breath catches. You see faces you will never forget. Faces shaped by nightmare. Their heads are elongated, pushed into strange, pointed shapes like demons from a fever dream. Their eyes hold a darkness you cannot understand. They have seen the end of the world, and they have brought it with them. At their front rides a man. He looks ordinary, short, broad chest, a thin beard. For a second, you almost laugh at the contrast, until your eyes meet his. In that glance, you feel your soul grow old. There is no anger there, no passion. Only a terrible calculating emptiness. It is the look of a force of nature. A man to whom you are not a person, but an obstacle. You are looking at Attila, king of the Huns. You have approximately 4 minutes left to live. This is not just a story about a battle. This is the story of how a single man became a walking apocalypse. How a name became a synonym for the end of the world. How a chieftain earned a title that would haunt history forever. Flagellum Day. The Scourge of God. I must warn you, this story descends into true darkness. To understand Attila's power, you must understand not just what he did but what people believed he could do. The fear was his greatest weapon. Our story begins not with Attila, but with the world that created him. A world the proud Romans could not comprehend, and did not want to. The year is roughly 406 AD. On a map, the Roman Empire still looks vast and powerful, but maps lie. The empire is sick. It is bleeding from 1,000 small wounds. Its borders are cracking. Germanic tribes are flooding across the Rhine River. Corruption is normal. Money is worthless. And far to the east, beyond the last Roman outpost, beyond the edge of the civilized world, something is stirring on the Great Steppe. A people who live by a different set of rules entirely. The Romans called them the Huns. The Romans did not understand the Huns. And what we do not understand we fear. The Huns were not farmers or city-minus dwellers. They were born to the saddle. They lived on horseback. They died on horseback. Roman historians wrote of them with disgust and terror, calling them creatures barely human. Consider this: the Huns practiced cranial deformation. When a baby was born, they would tightly bind its soft skull with cloth and boards. They forced the growing bone into an elongated, conical shape. Imagine facing an army where every warrior's head looked taily and unnatural. Like something from another world. This was not fashion. This was psychological warfare beginning years before any battle. Where Roman legionary first saw a Hun warrior's deformed skull, many believed they were facing literal demons from hell. Their way of life was alien. Romans claimed Huns were so at home on horseback they could barely walk on the ground. They ate, slept, and held council meetings in the saddle. They would place raw meat under their saddles at dawn. A day's riding would tenderize it with heat and pressure. At night they would eat it raw and warm. Their weapon was the composite bow, a masterpiece of engineering that could punch through Roman armor at distances that left legionaries helpless. Their tactics were not about honor, but victory. They swarmed. They pretended to retreat to draw enemies into traps. They moved like smoke, impossible to pin down. To Rome, a civilization built on order, stone, and law, the Huns were chaos incarnate. And into this world of horsemen, vast skies, around the year 406 AD, Attila was born. Attila's path to absolute power began not in a battlefield, but with a quiet, cold act of betrayal. A lesson most legends conveniently skip. By 434 AD, the Hun Empire was ruled by 2 brothers, Attila and Bled A. They inherited the throne together. For 10 years they co-ruled, a dual kingship of the steppes. They launched devastating raids into the Eastern Roman Empire, extorting thousands of pounds of gold and tribute protection money on a continental scale. But Attila was not a man who liked to share. He didn't just want power. He wanted absolute power. He wanted the world to hear the Huns and think of one phrase only his. Around 445 AD, his brother bled eight-eyed. The official records are silent. No glorious battle death. No tragic illness. Just gone. Historians, piecing together the whispers of history, agree on the probable truth Attila murdered his own brother. Think about the chilling calculation that required. This wasn't a crime of rage or passion. This was a clinical decision. Attila looked at his own flesh and blood, the man he had ruled beside for a decade, and saw him for what he was: an obstacle. Was it poison? A staged hunting accident? A knife in the dark? We will never know. And that was the point. Attila made sure of it. With bled removed, Attila didn't just take the throne. He transformed the loose Hun confederation into a single, terrifying instrument of his own will. He united the tribes not through friendship, but through iron-fisted control and the promise of limitless plunder. And here Attila revealed his genius for psychological domination. A Roman diplomat named Priscius visited Attila's camp in 448 AD. He described a feast that speaks volumes. The tent was filled with powerful men, allied kings, Gothic chieftains, Roman ambassadors. They lounged on cushions, feasting from plates of solid silver and gold. They drank from jeweled cups. They wore fine silks and glittering armor, displaying the wealth of 100 conquered cities. And Attila? He sat at the head of it all, on a simple wooden stool. He ate boiled meat from a plain wooden plate. He drank from a wooden cup. He wore clean, undecorated clothes. No gold, no jewels. While his guests laughed and boasted, Attila's expression never changed. No smile, no small talk. Just watchful, silent observation. This wasn't humility. This was a masterclass in dominance. He was sending a clear, chilling message: you need these shiny things to feel powerful. I do not. Your wealth comes from me. Your power is an illusion I allow. I am the center. You all simply orbit me. It worked. Priscius wrote that men were physically intimidated by Attila. Though he was short and unremarkable, he had a broad chest, small, deep-set eyes, and a thin beard. Nothing in his appearance should have commanded fear, but everyone who met him mentioned the eyes. Priscius said Attila could control a room with a bland-faced air that made you feel he could see every secret, every lie, every cowardly thought you'd ever had. He had built an aura of terror without saying a word. His first target for this refined weapon of fear was the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople. The Romans had a tired policy for barbarians pay them off. It was expensive, but cheaper than war. So they paid the Huns mountains of gold to stay away. Then, in 441 AD, the Eastern Empire made a fatal error. They were late with a payment. Attila did not send a reminder. He did not demand to renegotiate. He unleashed total war. His army flooded into the Balkans like a human tsunami. But this was different from typical raiding. This wasn't just for loot. This was a message, written in fire and blood. The city of Nais's modern -Nis, Serbia, was one of the first to fall. When the walls were breached, Attila gave the order that would become his grim signature: erase it. What followed was systematic annihilation. Soldiers killed every living thing, man, woman, child, even livestock. Buildings were burned to their foundations. Wells were poisoned with corpses. They didn't just sack Naissus, they deleted it from the landscape. The horror didn't end there. Years later, Roman diplomats traveling through the region reported they could not even approach the ruins of Naissus. The stench of death, years old, was still so overpowering it made the area uninhabitable. The riverbanks were still white with bones. Naissus was not unique. Over 70 cities in the Balkans suffered the same fate. Attila was not conquering territory, he was creating a grotesque monument to the cost of defying him. Broken, the Eastern Empire surrendered. The Treaty of 443 AD was a humiliation carved into parchment. The annual tribute was tripled. Rome had to create a vast no-go zone along the Danube. Most insulting of all, the treaty stated that Romans who fled to Hun lands could stay, but Huns who fled to Rome had to be returned. The empire that once ruled the world was now legally inferior to nomadic horsemen, and Attila was just warming up. In 447 AD, he struck again, pushing deeper than ever before. His armies reached as far as Thermopylae in Greece, the legendary pass, where 300 Spartans had once defended Greece from Persia. The symbolism was a crushing blow to the Roman psyche. The defenders of civilization were being chased back through their own most heroic gates. Facing total collapse, the Eastern Emperor was forced to sign another treaty, more degrading and expensive than the last. As Christian communities watched this unstoppable force, a terrifying idea took root: this wasn't a man. This was divine punishment. God was using this barbarian to whip them for their sins. They gave him the title that would define him for eternity: Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. And the most chilling part, Attila loved it. He adopted the title himself. He understood that if people believed he was an instrument of God's wrath, their will to fight would vanish. Why resist the will of heaven? It was the ultimate psychological weapon, and he wielded it perfectly. By 450 AD, the Eastern Empire was bankrupt and broken, drained of gold and courage. Attila now turned his gaze west. For his next invasion, he found the strangest excuse in history: a story involving a desperate Roman princess and a single fateful ring. By 450 AD, Attila had squeezed the Eastern Roman Empire dry, his gaze now fixed on the richer but crumbling West. For this new war he needed a pretext. The one he found was so audaciously flimsy, it revealed his true power. He no longer needed real reasons, only excuses the world was too terrified to question. In Ravenna, capital of the Western Empire, lived a woman named Honoria. She was the sister of Emperor Valentinian III, a princess of the most powerful family on earth. And she was utterly miserable. Trapped in the gilded cage of palace politics, she had been caught in an affair. As punishment, her brother was forcing her into a loveless marriage with a boring, safe Senator Ray life sentence of polite obscurity. In a moment of desperate defiance, Honoria did something reckless. She sent her personal ring to Attila the Hun, along with a secret letter begging him to help her. To any sane ruler, this was a curious plea from a distressed noblewoman. To Attila it was a gift. He declared to the world that Honoria's ring was a formal proposal of marriage. As her rightful husband, he claimed he was owed half of the Western Roman Empire as hereditary. It was absurd. Everyone knew it was absurd. But it didn't matter. The Scourge of God had spoken. When Emperor Valentinian refused the offer, Attila had his war. In the spring of 451 AD, Attila unleashed his greatest army, yet a colossal force of Hun's subject tribes, perhaps 100,000 strong. They crossed the Rhine River into the province of Gaul, modern France. What followed was not a campaign, but a cleansing fire. City after city ceased to exist. Metz was sacked and burned, allegedly on Easter Sunday. Strasbourg fell. The wave of destruction rolled westward, unstoppable. It seemed nothing could stand before Attila's eye. But in the Roman general Flavius Aetius, Attila finally met a mind that understood him. Aetius had spent years as a hostage with the Huns in his youth. He spoke their language, knew their tactics, and respected their ferocity. He also knew their weakness. They were a coalition, not a monolith. With brilliant diplomacy, Aetius performed a miracle. He united Rome with its bitterest enemy, the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe settled in southwestern Gaul. Their king, Theodoric I, hated Rome, but he feared Attila more. To ancient enemies stood shoulder to shoulder against the common nightmare. The two colossal armies met in June of 451 AD on the Canal and Union Plains, near modern Seine-Champagne, France. The field was wide and open, perfect for Hun cavalry. This would be the decisive clash. As dawn broke, the ground trembled. Attila, ever the showman, delayed his attack until the night hour around 3 p.m., consulting his shamans. They prophesied disaster for the Huns but foretold the death of a great enemy leader. Attila took this as a sign the enemy commander Aetius would die. He gave the order to attack. What followed was one of the bloodiest single days in ancient European history. This was not the ordered warfare of Roman legions. It was a swirling, screaming chaos of tens of thousands of men. The air grew thick with the metallic smell of blood and the sour stench of fear. Visigothic infantry smashed into Hun lines. Mounted archers swarmed Roman positions. The center of the battle was a furious struggle for a ridge of high ground, which changed hands multiple times. King Theodoric of the Visigoths was in the thick of the fighting. As the prophecy warned, a great leader fell, but it was Theodoric, not Aetius. He was knocked from his horse and trampled to death in the mud, his body lost in the carnage. The battle raged until nightfall. When darkness finally fell, the field was a moonlit landscape of the dead and dying. Ancient sources claim losses in the hundreds of thousands. Modern estimates suggest a still staggering 50,000 to 80,000 casualties. The Catalonian plains had drunk deeply. Attila, for the first time in his life, was checked. His aura of invincibility was cracked. He withdrew his battered army to a fortified camp of wagons, his back to a river. Legend says he built a pyramid of saddles, vowing to burn himself alive upon it if the Romans broke through. But the final blow never came. Aetius, the master strategist, made a cold calculation. He let Attila retreat. Why? Perhaps he knew a wounded Hun king was still useful, a threat to keep his own Visigothic allies in line. Perhaps his own army was too shattered to finish the job. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was technically a tactical draw, but strategically, it was a defeat for Attila. He had been stopped. He turned his army around and left Gaul. Yet a wounded predator is the most dangerous. Attila's pride was injured, and in his rage, he would turn to a target closer to the heart of Rome itself. The next year, he would invade Italy, and his vengeance would give birth to a legend, not of a city destroyed, but of a city born from terror. A wounded animal is dangerous. A wounded Attila was apocalyptic. His pride stung by the check in Gaul, he turned his rage south. In 450 AD, he led his regrouped, vengeful army across the Alps and into the very heart of Roman Italy. His first major target was Aquileia. This was no ordinary town. It was one of the wealthiest, most fortified cities in the entire empire, a gleaming hub of trade and culture. Its massive walls were considered impregnable. Its citizens, watching the Huns approach from their high towers, felt confident. They had enough supplies to outlast a siege of months, even years. For 3 months, the Huns battered the walls. They launched assaults. They tried to tunnel. The defenders held firm, their confidence growing with each failed attack. It seemed Attila had finally met his match in stone and Roman resolve. Then, one afternoon, Attila was riding along his lines, his expression unreadable. He watched the city, not with anger, but with the patience of a predator. His eyes caught a movement high on a city tower. A flock of storks, which had built their nests on the battlements, were suddenly taking flight. They were abandoning their homes, their young clutched in their beaks, fleeing eastward. To Attila, a man deeply attuned to the omens of the natural world, this was a sign. Even the birds knew the city was doomed. He turned to his generals. The birds are the guardians of the house, he is said to have declared. They foresee disaster and flee. This is no longer a place of safety. It is a place of death. He ordered one final, overwhelming assault. Whether inspired by the omen or simply exhausting the defenders, it worked. The mighty walls of Aquileia were breached. What happened next was not a sacking. It was an erasure. Attila gave the order he had perfected in the Balkans, but now with a colder, more terrible focus. He did not want loot. He wanted to make an example that would echo through eternity. Every soldier, every citizen, every living creature within the walls was to be killed or enslaved. Every building from the Grand Basilica to the humblest hut was to be torn down, stone from stone. Every trace of Aquileia's thousand-year history was to be scoured from the earth. The Huns set to work with methodical horror. They slaughtered, they burned, they pried apart temples and palaces, throwing the stones into the rivers. When they were finished, they did not leave behind ruins. They left behind a blank space, a field of shattered rock and ash. So complete was the destruction that travelers passing the site years later reported seeing nothing but a desolate wasteland. They could not even tell a great city had once stood there. But from this absolute zero, a flicker of life escaped. A handful of survivors, shattered and terrified, fled not to another city, but into the one place the Hun cavalry could not follow, the vast, trackless marshes and lagoons of the Adriatic coast. They waded into the water, carrying only what they could hold. They reached a scattering of low, muddy islands in the lagoon. Here, they drove wooden piles into the soft seabed. On these platforms, above the water, they built crude shelters. They chose a life of mud, mist, and sea over the certain death on land. They believed the horsemen of the apocalypse could not reach them here. They were right. That desperate refuge, born from pure terror, would slowly grow. More refugees from Attila's wrath would find it. They would build again, on wood and water. That settlement would eventually become Venice, the Serene Republic, one of the most beautiful and powerful cities in human history. Its origin story is not one of glory, but of survival. It was literally built by people who looked at Attila and decided living on stilts in a swamp was a better option. With Aquileia in memory, Attila's army swept through northern Italy like a Sith. Padua, Verona, and mighty Milan all fell. Their wealth was looted, their people killed or marched away in chains. The road to Rome itself, the heart of the world, now lay open and undefended. In Ravenna, Emperor Valentinian II panicked. He abandoned his palace and fled south to the older, stronger walls of Rome itself. The Roman Senate met in emergency session. The truth they faced was paralyzing. There was no army left to stop him. 80 SS forces were scattered. The Visigoths were gone. Italy was naked. In Rome, terror took root. The great city which had ruled the known world for centuries prepared for its end. Wealthy families buried their treasures or fled. Temples filled with weeping citizens praying for a miracle. The air buzzed with horrific rumors. Attila would burn the city, sow the earth with salt, enslave every last soul. With no military option, the Senate made a desperate, unprecedented gamble. They would send a delegation to negotiate with the devil himself, but they would not send a general or a politician. They sent the one man whose authority transcended emperors and armies, Pope Leo I. The scene was surreal. Near the river Mincio in northern Italy, the elderly bishop of Rome, dressed in simple, majestic robes, walked out to meet the Scourge of God. Attila, surrounded by his grim-faced, skull-shaped warriors, awaited him. No record exists of what was said, but somehow, the unthinkable happened. After their meeting, Attila turned his army around. He left Italy. Rome was spared. Christian legend says Saints Peter and Paul appeared in the sky behind Leo, brandishing flaming swords, and Attila fled in holy terror. The more likely, pragmatic truth is less divine. Attila's army was exhausted, plagued by disease, likely malaria from the Italian marshes, and short on food. Worse, news had reached him that a new Roman army from the east was attacking his homeland across the Danube. The choice was between a costly siege of a symbolic city and the defense of his actual power base. Perhaps Leo simply delivered this strategic reality, along with the promise of more gold. Or perhaps in a moment of chilling calculation, Attila decided a Rome left standing, terrified and paying tribute, was more useful than a Rome reduced to another smoldering patch of earth. Whatever the reason, the Scourge of God withdrew. The miracle, whether of heaven or cold politics, was complete. But for Attila, time was running out. His final act would be as bizarre and anticlimactic as his life had been dramatic and terrifying. The Scourge of God had turned away from Rome. He returned to the vast Hungarian plains, to his wooden palace complex, his power seemingly ended. But the clock was ticking. In 453 AD, at the age of about 47, Attila took yet another wife, a young woman named Ildiko. It was another political union, a means to bind a tribe to his will. The wedding feast was legendary in its excess. Attila, the man of the wooden plate, indulged. He ate heavily. He drank deeply, celebrating late into the night with his chiefs. Finally, he retired to his private chambers with his new bride. The next morning, silence. Attila was a creature of rigid habit, always rising at dawn. As the sun climbed, his personal guards grew anxious. The heavy doors to his chamber remained shut. They called out. No answer. A deep, unsettling quiet seeped from the room. Finally, they forced the door open. Inside, they found a scene of domestic horror. The young bride Ildiko sat huddled and weeping, paralyzed by terror. And on the bed, lying in a grotesque pool of blood that had soaked the linens, was Attila. The mighty king was dead. There were no battle wounds, no signs of a struggle. The official cause, reported by the historian Priscius, was a massive, violent nosebleed. The theory goes, overcome by the heavy drinking and rich food, Attila suffered a hemorrhage in his sleep. In his drunken stupor, he drowned in his own blood. The man who had drowned empires in blood died choking on his own. It was perhaps the most anticlimactic death in ancient history. The living embodiment of apocalypse, felled not by a rival's sword or a hero's arrow, but by a bodily flaw. Of course, whispers of murder swirled instantly. Was Ildiko an assassin? Was she a pawn of Rome, or a rival Hun faction? Did someone poison his wedding cup? The mystery has fueled speculation for 1500 years. But the lack of an immediate coup or uprising suggests the simpler, stranger truth the universe had claimed Attila with a bizarre, mundane twist of fate. His warriors were devastated. Their world had revolved around his will, and now that center was gone. The historian Jordan S. describes their raw, brutal grief. They cut their own faces with swords, gasing their cheeks, so that the greatest of all warriors should be mourned, not with the tears of women, but with the blood of men. They then held a massive funeral feast where they drank, sang, and fought in a frenzied celebration of his life amidst their despair. His burial was a final act of secrecy and power. Legend says he was placed in a triple coffin, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron, symbolizing the tributes he had extorted and the empires he had broken. This coffin was buried in the dead of night, in a location known only to a select few. Some tales say they diverted a river, buried him in its bed, and then let the waters flow back to conceal the spot forever. To ensure the secret died with them, the slaves who dug the grave were executed on the spot. To this day, despite countless searches and theories, the tomb of Attila the Hun has never been found. He disappeared into the earth as completely as he had once erased cities from it. His empire disappeared almost as quickly. Without his iron will to bind them, his sons squabbled over the shattered kingdom. The subject tribes they had terrorized for a generation rose in furious rebellion. At the Battle of Nidau in 454 AD, just a year after Attila's death, a coalition of Germanic peoples shattered the Hun army. Attila's eldest son and heir Lse was killed. The Hun Empire, a supernova of terror that had lit the sky of Europe for 2 decades, collapsed into darkness. Its people scattered, absorbed by other tribes, fading from history almost as suddenly as they had arrived. Attila never conquered Rome. He built no lasting monuments. His empire evaporated within a year of his death. And yet, his impact was deeper and more enduring than any conqueror who left statues behind. His true legacy was fear as a strategic weapon. He perfected the art of psychological warfare on a continental scale. He understood that a reputation for absolute, merciless destruction could paralyze enemies more effectively than any army. The title Scourge of God was just propaganda. It was a masterstroke that framed resistance as blasphemy. He was the accelerant of the fall. While Rome was already in decline, Attila hammered its weakened foundations. The cities he erased were economic and administrative nodes that never recovered. The tons of gold he extracted bankrupted the imperial treasury. The floods of refugees from his campaigns destabilized every province they entered. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD, just 23 years after his death, it did so in a world he had helped make poorer, more fractured, and infinitely more terrified. Most powerfully, he became an eternal archetype. His name transcended history to become a universal shorthand. For 1500 years, to call someone an Attila has meant one thing: a being of pure ruthless civilization minus destroying force. He is the barbarian at the gate in our collective nightmare. He reminds us in our bones of the fragile line between order and chaos, between the forum and the wilderness. The man died from a nosebleed. The myth he crafted of the inescapable God minus sense courage achieved immortality. He sleeps in an unknown grave, but his shadow still falls across history. The dark reminder that sometimes, the most powerful thing a leader can build is not a city, but a legend of terror. Attila's death did not leave a unified kingdom behind. It left a power structure that instantly imploded, consumed by the vacuum he left. The manner of his death, so mundane, so undignified, struck a fatal blow to the myth of the Scourge of God. If God's chosen instrument could perish so ignobly, choking on his own blood, then where did his power truly lie? This doubt spread like wildfire through the steppe tribes. The succession was a disaster. Attila had never clearly designated an heir, perhaps believing his empire was as immortal as his legend. His sons Lse, then Isaac, and Erne immediately turned on each other. They were not unifiers like their father, they were squabbling claimants. They lacked his genius for intimidation, inheriting only his appetite for plunder. Thus, the mighty imperial machine shattered into pieces that began fighting amongst themselves. The subjugated tribes were the first to sense the opportunity. The Gepids, Ostrogoths, Heruli, and Skyr peoples who had knelt under the Hunnicinvasions hill for a generation swiftly formed an unlikely coalition of vengeance. The fear and hatred they had bottled up for decades now transformed into furious rebellion. The Battle of Nidau 450 AD was the empire's death knell. This clash lacked Attila's tactical cunning. It was a raw, head-on collision of two enraged armies. On one side, the divided Huns and their remaining allies. On the other, the united Germanic tribal coalition. The fighting was bloody and direct. Attila's eldest son and primary heir, LSC, fell in the combat. His head was reportedly mounted on a spear as a trophy, a symbolic and utter humiliation for people who had once viewed the Roman world as their hunting ground. The defeated Hunnic hosts scattered like a retreating tide. Some fled east, back into the depths of the Eurasian steppe, their bloodlines merging with other nomadic peoples. Others remained, serving as mercenaries or subjects for their new Germanic masters. The vast political entity that had forced both Roman empires to their knees evaporated almost overnight. Its disappearance was as sudden and dizzying as its rise. Yet, Attila's ruin doing occurred not on the battlefield at Nidau, but in the shifting consciousness of posthumous Europe. The terrifying horror of the scourge dissipated. People realized the swoop of God could bleed and die in a manner that bordered on the absurd. Fear, once demystified it, loses its power. The Romans, particularly in the east, breathed a collective sigh of relief and began systematically erasing his psychological footprint. They stopped the tribute payments, rebuilt their frontier defenses, and in their histories, began to recast him as a fearsome but ultimately failed barbarian chieftain. For the West, however, the wounds Attila had inflicted were already festering and led to a fatal infection. While he did not personally topple the Western Roman Empire, he delivered a series of blows from which it could never recover. Economic hemorrhage, decades of extorted tribute, thousands of pounds of gold had drained the imperial treasury, leaving it unable to pay its armies, maintain infrastructure, or govern effectively. Demographic and urban annihilation from the Balkans to Gaul to Italy, dozens of prosperous cities had been erased. This was not just a loss of buildings but a catastrophic destruction of tax bases, administrative nodes, and cultural centers. The resources to rebuild them were gone. A permanent shift in the political landscape. To fight Attila, Rome was forced to arm and empower its barbarian allies like the Visigoths within its borders, granting them unprecedented legitimacy and autonomy. These allies soon realized they no longer needed Rome. Nearly 2 years after Attila's death, the Visigoths established an independent kingdom in Aquitaine. Others followed. Refugee crises and military colonization to repopulate devastated regions and reward allied tribes. The empire allowed entire Germanic tribes to settle within its borders as foederati. These groups maintained their own laws, chieftains, and military loyalty. The empire became a patchwork of states within a state, and central Roman authority became a fiction. Thus, when in 476, Eddie the Germanic commander Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, it was not a sudden catastrophe, but the final administrative step in a generation-long systemic collapse that Attila had set in motion. Odoacer did not even bother to declare himself emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, claiming the West no longer needed an emperor. The gesture said it all. The heart of the empire had stopped beating long before, and Attila had been the most violent of its fatal arrhythmias. Attila himself was dust, his grave lost. But the fear he sowed, the destabilizing forces he unleashed, and the centrifugal trends he accelerated shaped Europe's landscape for the next millennium. He unwittingly paved the way for the rise of the Germanic kingdoms that would be built upon Rome's ruins, the very foundations of modern Europe. His legacy is dual. He is both the archetypal destroyer whose name became synonymous with civilization's fragile edge, and the unwitting midwife to a new world order born from the chaos he reveled in creating. The shadow of a man who died from a nosebleed is longer than that of any marble emperor. It is the shadow of chaos itself, and it never truly fades. The story of Attila did not end in the dust of the 5th century. In many ways, his death and his empire's dissolution were merely the beginning of his longest, most significant campaign, the conquest of the European imagination. His physical form faded, but his image transformed into a ghost in the collective memory, a powerful, malleable symbol constantly reshaped and repurposed by different eras and nations. First, fragmented legends from Scourge to Storybook King. In the myths and epics of European peoples, Attila shattered into many different faces. In Germanic and Norse legend like the Nibelungen, the Volsung saga, he appears as Attila. Here he is no longer the world-shattering destroyer, but a wealthy, cunning and ultimately doomed king. The core story often revolves around his treacherous seizure of a Nibelung treasure and his subsequent murder by his vengeful wife, Gudrilla, character inspired by the historical Ildiko. This is a moralized adaptation. It reduces an incomprehensible historical horror into a familial tragedy of betrayal and personal revenge, thereby narratively taming the terror. In Hungarian national epic, he is revered as the great ancestral hero, Attila the ancestral hero. Despite the historical fact that the Huns and the Magyars, the main ancestors of Hungarians, were distinct peoples separated by centuries. The Magyars, upon settling the Pannonian Plain, the heart of Attila's empire, in the late 9th century, actively incorporated this most famous Hun into their origin myth. This granted their new kingdom a more illustrious and fearsome historical depth. He became a source of courage and national potency. Second, the Christian mirror scourge or divine test. Within Christian theology and historiography, Attila's interpretation remained fraught with tension. On one hand, he was undeniably the flagellum Dei, God's terrible instrument to punish a corrupt Rome. On the other, his ultimate retreat from Rome was seen as proof of God's mercy and the power of faithful prayer. For centuries, the Church used Attila's story as a dual lesson, a warning that the arrogance of secular power invites divine chastisement, and a demonstration that pious intercession can yield miraculous salvation. His destructive force was thus given a redemptive purpose within a grand sacred narrative. Third, a tool for modern politics, the appropriated barbarian. With the rise of 19th and 20th century nationalism, Attila's image was seized and twisted by political propaganda. In Germany, some pan-Germanic thinkers briefly attempted to recast Attila as an early pioneer leading Germanic tribes against decadent Latin civilization, fitting him into a fabricated, purely anti-Roman lineage of heroes. During World War II, Nazi propaganda opportunistic evoked his image, emphasizing his decisive from the East to serve their geopolitical narratives. In the Cold War era, some Western popular culture inadvertently portrayed the steppe conqueror as a historical precursor to an Iron Curtain, reflecting contemporary ideological anxieties. Fourth, a dark case study in leadership and power. In modern studies of management and leadership, Attila stands as an extreme but compelling case study. He demonstrates the astonishing efficacy and the ultimate limits of fear as an organizational and motivational tool. He maintained internal cohesion by creating an absolute external threat and replaced institutional structures with a cult of personality. His empire was a galaxy orbiting a single magnetic pole. The moment that pole vanished, the gravitational pull collapsed instantly. It provides a near-perfect historical specimen for studying the fatal flaws of charismatic authority, its sustainability and succession crisis. Fifth, the pop-culture archetype. In films, games, and novels, the name Attila has become a self-explanatory code for the ultimate barbarian. He represents pure irrational civilization obliterating force from beyond the borders. This simplification strips away historical specifics, yet it proves how deeply his image is embedded in the West's narrative structures of self versus other and civilization versus barbarism. He no longer needs to be real, he is a cultural trope. From a flesh and blunt source of terror, to a legendary character, to a political symbol and cultural archetype, Attila's life after his biological death has been one of remarkable polygenesis. Historians seek the real Attila, the Hun king of the 5th century. But often more powerful and far-reaching is the mythic Attila, an empty vessel perpetually filled and refilled by the fears, imaginations, and needs of later generations. He reminds us that the most enduring conquest may not be of territory, but of the imagination itself. The real Attila lies in an unmarked riverbed. The mythic Attila continues to speak, and we are the ones who keep rewriting his script. To truly grasp Attila's impact, we must look past the burning cities and the piles of gold. We must understand the machine he built, not just an army, but a self-sustaining economy of fear. His empire functioned like a predatory organism, and its methods reveal a cold, brilliant logic. The steppe war machine more than just horsemen. While the composite bow and deformed skulls were terrifying, the Hun military's true strength was its logistical nightmarishness for Rome. They moved with a speed and cohesion that defied Roman understanding. A Roman army marched with carts, siege engines, and baggage trains. By Hunnicinvasions they moved with its entire society, families, herds, felt tents, all on horseback. They carried dried meat, cheese, and mare's milk. They could strike 300 miles away, vanish into the steppe, and reappear on a different frontier before Roman scouts could even confirm their location. This wasn't an invasion, it was an apparition. Their communication was equally baffling. They used a system of whistling arrows for battlefield signals, and could coordinate complex maneuvers across vast distances with an efficiency that seemed supernatural to the legionaries, who relied on shouted orders and trumpet calls. The economy of extortion, a calculated business model. Attila's campaigns were not random raids. They were precision instruments of financial extraction. His demands for tribute were meticulously calibrated. He asked not for what would bankrupt Rome instantly, but for an amount so enormous it would cripple them for years, yet just small enough that paying it seemed preferable to the certain destruction of war. He turned the Roman policy of pay the barbarians to go away into a ruinous subscription service. The gold he took did not just sit in chests. It was the lifeblood of his political control. He distributed it to his subordinate kings and chieftains, buying their loyalty and financing their own war-beds. He created a patronage network where allegiance to Attila was the only path to wealth. The Roman Empire was essentially funding its own torment, its gold cycling back to arm the very warriors who would demand more the following year. The psychology of the scourge weaponizing belief. Attila's adoption of the title Flagellum Dei was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. In the late Roman world, where Christianity's grip was tightening, every event was seen through a lens of divine will, plague, famine, and military defeat were punishments for sin. Attila inserted himself directly into this worldview. By positioning himself as God's chosen instrument, he did several devastating things. He paralyzed military resistance. For a devout Christian soldier, fighting Attila could feel like fighting God's own judgment. Morale crumbled before the first arrow was fired. He undermined political leadership. If Attila was God's punishment, then the current Roman emperors must be grievous sinners. Their legitimacy eroded with every city he destroyed. He created a perverse form of legitimacy for himself. He was no longer just a barbarian invader, he was an actor in a divine drama. This made negotiating with him, however humiliating, seem like part of a cosmic plan rather than simple surrender. The aftermath, a landscape of ghosts. The true measure of Attila's success is not in the battles he won, but in the silence he left behind. When his armies finally departed a region, they did not leave a conquered province to be administered. They left a scorched cognitive map. Survivors who crept back to the sites of cities like Aquileia or Narcissus found not ruins but voids. The thoroughness of the destruction erased not just buildings, but landmarks, roads, and memories. It created a trauma geography. These places became non-loci, holes in the fabric of the known world, spoken of in whispers. This erasure had a profound psychological effect, creating a sense that civilization itself was ephemeral, that the world could literally be unmade. This is the legacy that outlived his empire. He proved that the greatest power lies not in building walls, but in making people believe that no wall can ever be high enough. He demonstrated that the most valuable currency in the world is not gold, but terror, and that a reputation carefully crafted and brutally enforced can bend history itself. The man is gone. The myth he engineered the equation of his name with inexorable, divine retribution that is what conquered the ages. We remember the Caesars for what they built. We remember Attila for proving how easily it could all be taken apart.